Good morning and welcome to Environment Journal's EnviroExchange webinar series. My name is Corinne Lynds and I'm the content director here at Actual Media. I'll be your moderator for today's discussion on powering the energy transformation. By now, you've probably noticed a few people checking in on the right-hand side with the chat feature. Please say hello, let us know who you are and where you're from. Right above the chat, you'll also see an Actual Media icon. If you click follow, you'll continue to be updated on our EnviroExchange series as new webinars are announced. And down below, you'll see a variety of information. You'll see the polls feature where we encourage you to cast your votes. You'll also see a little green button with rotating links to the speakers' websites. So be sure to check those out. And most importantly is the Ask a Question feature. So don't be shy about becoming part of the conversation. I'll do my best to pose your question to our panelists throughout the discussion. We have an impressive lineup of speakers joining us for this important discussion, but before I jump in and introduce them, I would like to take a few moments to acknowledge the many First Nations and Indigenous peoples of Canada as the original great stewards of this country. I'm here in Toronto, which is located on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. We all share in the responsibility of our natural infrastructure, and there's much we can learn from the traditional knowledge and the land, water, and materials that allow us to build projects that benefit all Canadians. All right, so let's meet our experts. I'm going to begin by inviting each of our panelists to the screen. Once they're all on screen, I'll have each of them spend just a few moments to introduce themselves and tell us a bit about where they're from, what their role is, and what perspective they bring to today's discussion. First up, we have Robert Hornung from the Canadian Renewable Energy Association. There he is. Good morning, Robert. And then we have up next is Chris Henderson from the Indigenous Clean Energy. Hello, Chris. And then we have Tom Mosseau from Capgemini, Canada. Welcome, Tom. And last but not least, we have Wendy Franks from Northland Power. Welcome, Wendy. Fantastic. So what I would love to do now is I'll go around and I'll get each of you to introduce yourself. Can you kick us off, please, Robert?
Sure, happy to do so. I'm happy to be here for this webinar today. I'm the President and CEO of the Canadian Renewable Energy Association. We're an association that represents about 300 companies active in keen to deploy wind energy, solar energy, and energy storage in Canada. And very pleased to be part of this discussion today. We have made a commitment as a country to move to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And every study that we've looked at that examines pathways to get there concludes that the backbone of any strategy to get there is going to be to decarbonize our electricity system and to expand that system to enable us to help to decarbonize other sectors like transportation, buildings, and industry, and also to produce green hydrogen to support that objective. And in fact, these studies illustrate that what we're looking at really is a need to increase the size of electricity production in Canada by somewhere between 1.5 times and a doubling in less than 30 years. So it's a really significant challenge that we're looking at. And we believe our technologies are going to play a pretty central role in addressing that because they represent the lowest cost sources of new non-emitting generation available in Canada today. We have abundant resources in terms of wind and solar that are untapped across the country. They're scalable technologies, so we can build them out incrementally as small projects, large projects, and we can deploy them rapidly. And one thing that I'm sure we're going to talk about today is how we need to really accelerate our efforts going forward. Last year, we released a vision document, a 2050 vision document that sort of spoke to the role that these technologies would play in the energy transition. And we identified a number of specific actions that would need to be taken to facilitate the deployment of technologies like these at the scale and speed required. And I hope we'll have a chance to talk about that a little bit over the course of the discussion today.
Great, thank you so much. All right, Chris, you're up next.
Thanks, Connie. Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Henderson. I'm the Executive Director of Indigenous Clean Energy, a not-for-profit Indigenous governed organization that promotes Indigenous participation in clean energy, as well as being the President of Lumos Energy. What I would say in my opening remarks is that I think the transition that we are all engaged with has some real tensions in the process. One is that we're trying to decolonize power. We're trying to take power from the centralized management and control of it into something that's more diversified and democratized. That requires new systems. And I don't think the systems of policy and regulation and decision-making are in place to get there. So how do we move forward on that front? Secondly, as I would say, there's really an opportunity for Indigenous to play a central role in terms of that transformation. They are already, which I'll speak to as we go along. And laterally, I'd say there's a tension between a lot of great activity to accelerate change, but a lot of stasis, a lot of status quo in the system that we have to change. So we need to get over those three particular challenges. One is to make sure that we really accelerate and change systems so we decolonize the electricity future we have. Two, and to engage local and Indigenous communities in part of that process where they are owners and decision makers along with that. And thirdly, we need to change the status quo into a dynamic change into the future. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, Tom, go for it.
Hi, thank you. Hello, everybody. Tom Mosseau. I'm National Head of Utilities Vertical representing Capgemini. Also sit on our Global Utilities Council, where we take inputs and a viewpoint from around the globe. And that's a 350,000 person team that operates in 50 countries that we're pulling information, activities, strategies from to help us shape our partnerships with clients, certainly here in Canada, on their strategies and how they can effect change for their net zero targets. Just one other call out, Capgemini is amongst some of the first companies globally to have our net zero targets validated according to SBTi's standards. With that, I'll pass it back to you.
Great, thank you. All right, Wendy, you are up.
Thanks, Connie. Can you confirm?
I can hear you great.
Okay. Okay, great. I was having some technical challenges. Hi, everyone. Wendy Franks. It's great to be here, and thank you for hosting this interesting discussion. My name is Wendy Franks. I'm the EVP of Strategy and Investment Management at Northland Power. Northland is a publicly traded company. We have a market cap of about 10 billion. We generate about 2 billion of revenue selling electricity into the grid. Most of our revenue comes from our 3 large offshore wind projects in Europe, about 60%. The remaining comes from our onshore wind assets in Ontario and Quebec, as well as our thermal fleet. So we have 4 natural gas power plants across Ontario and Saskatchewan. Northland Power has been at the forefront of the energy transition actually over the last 35 years. We were one of the first independent companies to build a natural gas plant as the country, as Canada, was transitioning from coal to gas. So we view ourselves as you know, historically having been at the forefront of change. My remit, my responsibilities include corporate strategy, but also our new initiatives businesses, which includes storage and hydrogen. And I'll say a few words about hydrogen because I'm particularly excited about that. There is a tremendous opportunity for Canada to generate and be at the forefront of the green hydrogen industry globally. Northland is involved, for example, in several projects on the east coast of Canada, where Canada actually has a world-class wind resource. We have a lot of wind, and it has, up until now, has not been harnessed because in general, we don't have enough of a population. So the best wind sites globally have actually been developed, but that's not the case in Canada, which is a tremendous opportunity because when it comes to creating green hydrogen and taking those green electrons and converting them into a molecule that can be stored and shipped and sold into the global green hydrogen economy, one of the big drivers of cost is actually your cost of electricity. And if you have higher wind speeds relative to other sites, it means your cost of electricity is lower, and it means that you're going to be more cost competitive. So I'm happy to discuss that further, but just to reiterate, we see a tremendous opportunity for Canada to be globally competitive, which I think is a really interesting opportunity for the country and an opportunity to create a lot of economic development while decarbonizing our economy. Back to you, Connie.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. We have got a lot to cover in just under an hour now, so I'm going to dive right in, set the scene a little bit. The energy sector in Canada is expected to change more in the next 10 years than it has in the last century. So today, we pulled this panel together to discuss how clean energy projects are transforming the grid. We don't have a crystal ball, so it's a bit difficult to predict exactly how the energy transition will roll out, but there are 3 key components of the energy transition we'll focus on today. That's the decarbonization of electricity, electrification, fuel switching, improving the transportation sector, and improving energy efficiency and behavioral changes. Having said all that, let's jump in with our first question. So I'll pose it to you. As Canada sets out to reach net zero GHG emissions by 2050, renewable energy systems, so wind, solar, and storage, are going to take on a more powerful role. How do you see each of these technologies driving decarbonization? And I'm just going to get feedback from everyone here. Is there anyone who would love to jump in to start? Otherwise, I'll just start picking names.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Wendy.
Robert, we're all going to jump in, but go ahead, Robert.
You can start.
Okay, well, I mean, as I mentioned in the opening remarks, I mean, I think these technologies are going to play a pretty central role in terms of this energy transition. They're not the whole story. Some of the other factors that you mentioned, energy efficiency, demand side management, going to be critical and central to moving forward. Other non-emitting technologies are also going to have to play a role. But I think these technologies, because of some of their inherent characteristics in terms of speed of deployment, cost, et cetera, will play a significant role. And in fact, again, some of these net zero pathway studies that have been developed in Canada see wind and solar growing from about 6% of electricity today to somewhere between 31% and 75% of electricity in 2050 in a grid that's 1.5 to 2 times larger. So it's a significant portion of the new investment that's going to be required to go forward. And, you know, on a positive note, we're starting to see some shift to deploying more wind and solar at the moment in the country. I mean, in the year 2020, there were only 200 megawatts of wind and solar installed in Canada. Last year, there was 1,000 megawatts. This year, there's going to be over 2,000 megawatts. In the last 2 years, we've seen proposals for procuring new wind and solar emerge from different provinces across the country that would see between 10 and 12,000 megawatts installed over the next few years. So these are all very positive signs, but we have to take it with a bit of a grain of salt, because to get to the transition that we want to achieve, we actually need to be installing 5,000 megawatts a year. So we're not there yet. And so we've got some positive initiatives that have come forward, but there are a number of key barriers and policies that are going to have to be addressed. Chris touched on one of them right away, and the fact that really the 2050 electricity system is going to look fundamentally different than the electricity system of today. It'll be a two-way system, not a one-way system. It's going to be much more diverse. It's going to be much more decentralized. It's going to be much more democratized. And technologically, we have a lot of the technologies already available to enable that. What we don't have are the regulatory market frameworks that actually enable us to deploy those technologies. And that's the key evolutionary step that has to happen. It has to happen rapidly if we're going to have any hope of achieving these goals.
Just building on that one point, Robert, around the scale, I think that's where the big gap is. If the current trajectory stayed the way it was, there'd be a very significant gap in the ability of renewables to handle the demand that's going to come on the systems by 2050. So what has to change to be able to allow the investments to happen, the growth in production of renewable sources? Something has to give, and I do think it is with policies and what needs to change from the regulatory bodies to not look to wait and see, but be more proactive and get out in front of these initiatives and help pave the way for the transformation that is happening now, and just make those inroads easier. And you'd mentioned other sources. One of the other sources I think is going to be critically important is battery. The advancements of battery and the advancements of being able to store that power and not have it on such a demand and supply tightrope, I think will greatly help the coverage that renewables can handle going forward as well.
Yeah, I agree with all those comments. A couple of additions. So for me, the transition where we're talking about technologies, and people like to ask the question a lot, like which technology is going to prevail? And we naturally get into this either or discussion. I really think this is a yes and discussion. The decarbonization is going to be difficult. It's technical. It's complicated systems. It's big dollars of capital, and it's really a yes and discussion. I see a role for a whole myriad of different technologies from our toolkit. I think we're going to need all of the all of the items in our toolkit, be it carbon capture, be it clean fuels, be it wind, solar, storage. I completely agree with that as well. The regulatory, it's a great point. The regulatory is so important. If people have followed what's happened in the United States with the Inflation Reduction Act, that has offered tremendous tax credits to renewable energy, and green hydrogen storage, etc. And there is going to be an amazing pull into the US market of not just capital, but also equipment, which is really in short supply right now, as well as talent. And if Canada's going to keep pace, we need to compete on more than just price, because the tax credits that are being offered in the United States are going to bring down the cost of renewable energy and correspondingly the cost of green hydrogen and storage much more than we're going to be able to compete on. And we need to be smarter, and we need to be better than that. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to offer better quality projects that are going to be reliable in our delivery of clean fuels or in the way that we operate our storage projects. And we need to be able to compete on speed to market. And what that means, it means that we need to have a competitive and thoughtful permitting and regulatory framework that allows developers like Northland and all of my peers in the industry to bring forward projects in a timely manner so that we can place orders for equipment now. We need to be placing orders for equipment now if we're going to be able to bring new storage projects into the system, because if we don't, the American projects are going to start placing orders, and they're going to take up all of that manufacturing capacity. So we need to be aware of what's going on a global basis, because it really impacts what's happening here in this country. And I would say that we are seeing that on the regulatory front. So for example, 2 days ago, the government of Nova Scotia announced a 5 gigawatt target, 5,000 megawatt target for offshore wind by 2030. And just to put that into perspective, that is 50% of the target that Japan has. So, I mean, that is a great starting point that the government has announced in Nova Scotia, when heretofore there actually wasn't even a permitting regime to bring new offshore wind into the province. So I want to sort of make a shout out to the provincial and the federal governments, because we are really seeing great partnership there. Which is maybe different than what the experience has been in other energy sectors, like an LNG, for example. It's been difficult for us to bring that forward as a country. And then the last point I wanted to make is that I don't believe that any big infrastructure project is going to be done in Canada without First Nations partnership. And that's extremely important at Northland. We have equity partners, First Nations partners, in our existing projects, and we look forward to continuing those relationships and to continue to offer those opportunities to provide cash flow and to provide benefits into our First Nations partners.
Seems like a good lead-in for you, Chris.
Yeah, and thanks for saying that, Wendy. Corinne, on certain days I'm optimistic, on other days I'm pessimistic about energy transformation. I'm very optimistic because of what my three colleagues have said in terms of both technology, developers, partners, Indigenous partners, and where they want to go. But I think in that pathway to that future, we have a logjam. And that logjam is fundamentally that in the current electricity system, we have systems that have been built for the 20th century, and we're now almost in we are in the third decade of the 21st century. So the way we make decisions about electricity is now a larger energy question, but our regulatory structures aren't built that way. And frankly, provincial and territorial governments, some are making great progress, as Wendy just said, but it's a real patchwork formation. So I think what we have to do is create a new entente, a new collaborative gathering, which brings together the people on one side of that logjam who want to take it forward, with people on the other side saying, we're worried about it. We're worried about this in terms of the cost of infrastructure. We're worried about this in the cost of the affordability of energy. We're worried about this and that decisions we may come back to bite us. So I think we have to break a logjam that's there. There are little bits of it that are changing, but frankly, I don't think the really hard pressure has really changed. And the pressure is getting more profound. One, we have to get there in terms of climate. Two, there's an incredible economic opportunity. Three, we can't miss opportunities, as Wendy's noted, in terms of the equipment and technologies that we need. But the logjam that we have to change requires a different approach. There's places for provincial and territorial governments, but there's also places for the federal government. And we have to marry that together. I don't think that's married, but as I say, some days I'm optimistic. Today I'm optimistic. Some days I worry that we're not quite there.
Just building on that a little bit, I think what's missing is how do you go from a pledge to an actionable strategy? How do you go from a real plan? Who are the stakeholders in that plan? Who are the groups that need to come together to be able to action this change? I mean, do you have a real roadmap to go and execute against your pledge? Do you understand the inputs and outputs of your pledge? What are the levers you have as individual companies that are trying to get to your own net zero commitments? And what are the strategies for renewable resources for your independent companies? Do you have carbon offsetting opportunities that you need to be looking at? So I think there's a real, we talk about the logjam, we talk about the regulatory bodies, but I also think there's a hesitation within the independent companies as well of they've put these pledges out there. They're trying to align with the public vision of what this is supposed to be, but do all the companies really know how to navigate through what these changes mean, and who do they need to be speaking to help them make the changes necessary to fulfill their promises that they're putting out there in the public?
Fantastic. All right, we do have a question from our audience here, so I'm going to read that quickly before we move on to our next scheduled program. Do the panelists feel that the current energy crisis in Europe will affect decision-making in the energy sector in Canada? If so, how?
Yeah, I can jump in on that.
It already has in a huge way. I mean, it's really, I think there's a window of opportunity here that's really remarkable, not just because of the situation in Ukraine and Europe, but in terms of forging a clean energy entente between Europe and Canada. One, in terms of supply of product, like, for example, in terms of hydrogen, but also in terms of technological and partnership relationships. We are seeing this move incredibly fast, like at lightning speed. And I think that's one of the very positive things we're seeing, because it's also brought together governments at the senior most level. So really good, but we now got to yield it and make sure we get the achievement we want to see.
Yeah, I think those are great comments. Building on that, the German Chancellor visited the east coast of Newfoundland in late August. It's unusual to get the German Chancellor to Canada, let alone to the east coast of Newfoundland. And that should give people a perspective of how important it is for our European, partners. And in many cases, many of us come from Europe originally. They are really struggling to find affordable, reliable, decarbonized sources of energy. And the Chancellor came here because he saw Canada as an opportunity of where he can source some of that energy. And the government then signed an MOU, a pact with Germany to deliver green hydrogen targeting 2025, which is, to Chris's point, that's in infrastructure land that is moving at light speed. Many people are talking about bringing green hydrogen projects online in 2030, and we're looking at doing it in half that time in Canada. And we have all of the makings to actually do it. We have the renewable power companies, not just Northland, but many others, Boralex, Intergex, Capital Power, Brookfield. We have the technology, the electrolyzer technology in Canada. So we have Stewart Energy, which is hydrogen optimized, which is a company that's been generating the electrolyzers, the equipment that generates the hydrogen for 3 generations. That company has exported Canadian electrolyzer technology to over 100 countries globally. And then we also have the wind resource. And if, to the point, Chris, if we can pull it all together, if we can get the permits, if we can get all the partners in place, we can raise the capital. There's no reason why we shouldn't do it. There's absolutely no reason why Canada should not be at the forefront of green hydrogen globally.
And I might just add that it's absolutely true that the situation in Europe has created new opportunities like this, which Canada is very well positioned to exploit. but we also can learn a lot from what Europe is now doing in terms of accelerating their efforts to try and accelerate the transition going forward. And you see some very innovative work going on in Europe, for example, to review permitting regimes to try and accelerate the deployment of new infrastructure. You see much more interest in collaboration, for example, in building transmission networks that strengthen the interconnectedness of the grid in Europe. And some of these things are, speak to the challenge that Chris spoke about earlier, in that we often in Canada are working to develop plans, but they're plans in silos, and we don't have enough coordination, we don't have enough collaboration. And I think we can learn a lot from some of the stuff that's going on in Europe right now, is they're trying to move very, very quickly to accelerate their transition.
Well, thank you, Patrick from Ottawa, for that great question. All right, so let's move back to our regularly scheduled question list here for a moment. And so momentum is accelerating for electrification, fuel switching, and improvements to the transportation sector. What are your thoughts, or what are the panel's thoughts in terms of improving access to EV charging and subsidies related to that?
I think this is almost a red herring. I think this is just a matter of timing. In terms of charging capacity and infrastructure, it's moving very quickly. I mean, we're currently with Indigenous Clean Energy installing charging capacity in around 50, 60 First Nations just this year. And it'll probably be a couple of hundred next year. So I think, the range anxiety that people have on EV systems, I think that's dissipating. It's rather marginal. Those of us like me who have an electric vehicle, we see it not an issue at all. So I think the charging infrastructure is not the really main problem. The problem is going to be the transition of fleets and the turnover you need and the capital needed to buy those electric cars, electric trucks, those electric vehicles that allow us to go into the future. So to me, that is just a timing issue. And there are issues within certain provinces and territories, but it's moving very, very fast.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is that the provincial government here in Ontario has a big push on to actually create the entire supply chain. So from mining the minerals to manufacturing the batteries, to other elements of the automotive industry, so that we provide locally more elements of the entire supply chain, so that we can be providing better accessibility to EVs for everyone. And bringing that supply chain here, creating the jobs that come along with that, helps to lower the cost of the EVs. It's a big positive feedback mechanism that can then ultimately increase the penetration of electric vehicles within our overall auto fleet.
The only thing I'll add in, and I do think it's a timing thing, because I think the wheels are turning for it to happen. I do believe there needs to be some focus on the grid improvements. That goes without saying. I mean, the grid needs to get smart, but these are big, massive programs. And where do you focus the grid getting smart, earlier than later? Where are the concentration of these EVs going to exist? If you're in a city here like Toronto, and then you get a mass exodus on the weekend to the lakes just north of our city, is that grid ready? Are those transformers ready to handle those peaks that are going to come from everybody wanting to charge their EVs on Friday evening when they get there, and Sunday afternoon when they're ready to head home? So I think there's some demand forecasting, some grid health forecasting. The capabilities are there, but how do we get serious and start looking at where do you focus the dollars on the grid improvements to handle the pace of the EV uptick?
Yeah, that's a great point. The other thing is that, so the grid in Ontario, it's actually 95% decarbonized in how we actually operate our grid. That's because we have a lot of nuclear and a lot of hydro. So last year, for example, natural gas only contributed to 6% of our overall energy output. But the forecast for our system operator is actually that the demand for electricity is going to rise. And the demand is rising very quickly, mostly because of transportation and charging EVs. And so what does that mean for the emissions around electricity? It actually means they're going up, because as we need to produce more electricity, the only place where we have excess capacity is actually in our natural gas fleet. So our hydro and our nuclear fleet and our renewable fleet is largely already running at capacity. So if you need to get more output from our grid, the main thing that our system operator can call upon is actually our natural gas fleet. And so as perversely, as we bring more electric vehicles into the fleet that require charging, and we increase our demand for electricity with our current grid configuration, it actually means that the emissions from our grid is going up. So it's really important that we have holistic planning as we think about what new assets we want to, new generating assets that we want to bring into our grid. And that's where actually bringing in more batteries would be a really good thing, because you can charge those batteries at night with low emission electricity, and then you can discharge them during the day when it's needed, when the electricity is needed.
Yeah, I'll just add, and the ISO is now, I think, finally paying very significant attention, I think, to the desire to bring battery storage onto the grid. We're going to see a couple of RFPs in that regard in the near term going forward at a scale that in Canada will at least be somewhat unprecedented. And there's a lot of work to do to try and avoid that outcome that was just described, in terms of, we're not looking to increase greenhouse gas emissions as part of this effort.
We have a question here that I feel we've partly answered maybe already, but transmission infrastructure seems lacking. Adding tons of power, whether solar and or wind, is fine and dandy, but can we get that power to end users without storage or major system upgrades?
I can take a first stab at it to say, in terms of getting to where we need to go in 2050, transmission is absolutely critical. But the first thing that we need to be thinking about in transmission is how we can use existing transmission more efficiently. Transmission is really expensive to build. It takes a long time to build. So how can we do that? And that means we need to be able to empower our decision-making processes to have us consider non-wires alternatives to building transition more frequently, which involves energy storage, distributed.
Chris, did you want to add on that? I feel like you might have been ready to.
No, I think Robert was going on it before. The digital world's got into some challenges there. Go ahead, Robert.
And I was just going to say, and this has been a tremendous challenge in Canada because of our seeming lack of ability to be able to reach interprovincial agreements on how to share the costs, share the risks of moving forward with transmission investment. I think the federal government's going to have a really important role to play in helping to ensure this build out actually takes place.
Okay.
Yeah, just note is that in order to overcome those challenges, we have to play the long game. And the challenges with a lot of electricity planning, we've typically been dealing with 5-year windows across the country in terms of fleet management and integrated supply plans. But transmission can't work that way. Transmission has to work in a 30 to 60-year cycle. And so therefore, the electricity planning that we have to do in terms of net zero, where we have a much higher demand load, as Wendy's noted, really has to think about what does it mean for 30 or 60 years. So I think that we see this more a bicameral or tricameral approach to electricity planning that needs to occur, recognizing that, one, you have to look at 5-year plans in terms of reliability of power and affordability of power, but you then have to look at a 30-year plan in terms of transmission, and then even a longer-term plan in terms of full net zero transition. And so that's an evolution in electricity planning that we have not seen yet, but we think there's a lot to learn. There's pieces of this in parts of the country, but it seems to be that we're isolated in every province and territory, separate, doing their own thing. We see some really good things happening as people know in the country, but boy, we really find that there's a national coming together that's needed to share those things and move electricity planning to be both short-term, medium-term, and long-term.
Great. All right, I would like to switch gears a little bit and focus a bit maybe on more on the consumer side of things. So when it comes to improving energy efficiency, we need a stronger connection to demand management and efficiency. What do you think are the most effective ways of changing consumer behavior?
Well, that's one of those really tough questions you put on the table, Corinne, because we've been trying to do this for a few decades with limited success. Some of the programs that are out there that are positive really have been at the margins. Is it consumer behavior? In part, yes, but it's more than that. With Indigenous communities, and we've identified in a report that we released early this year called Energy Foundations, we've identified the need to make every Indigenous home in every Indigenous community, Métis, First Nation, and Inuit, energy efficient with deep retrofits, not modest retrofits, deep retrofits, and fundamentally making every new build a net zero home. In order to do that, it's going to take capital. In our estimation, around $6 billion to $8 billion of capital needed to be able to do that. So how does that work together, both in terms of the behavior of consumers, the interests of consumers, the systemic needs to make that change? Can we bring the acumen we've had, for example, in the growth of renewable energy to energy efficiency? What does that mean in terms of partnerships, in this case, between Indigenous communities and private partners? And lastly, what is the financial model of that? We're actually going to kick off something this winter with a collaborative approach, and I invite our panelists here and anyone on this call to join that, as to how we design a new way that we actually move forward with energy efficient homes in Indigenous communities. Is that the answer for Canada? Well, partly, but there may be something that can be learned in non-Indigenous communities as well. But it's behavior, it's also about the delivery mechanism, the change mechanism, the capacity, and lastly, the financial tools to be able to do that.
That's a great answer. I would just add, I'm a big fan of providing consumers with good choices. So I think it's really up to corporates to provide products and services that are decarbonized so that consumers maybe don't even have to make the choice. There are a lot of companies now that are committed to decarbonizing their supply chain, and we're seeing that more and more in that corporates are wanting to buy directly from companies like Northland, directly buying green energy so that they can certify that all of the elements of the supply chain that went into a product come from green energy sources. So I'm actually very bullish that in a way consumers aren't going to have to change their behavior. They're just going to have a great set of opportunities, a great set of products and services in front of them that are decarbonized.
Yeah, just align with that. I mean, I see this kind of akin to the whole change in banking, and how you interact with your banks is very different than how you interacted with your banks. Where you would go into the branch, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And it's because of what Wendy called out, is the capability of the interfaces, the capability of exchanging information with the various stakeholders out there exists. So how do we, in this space, allow for the same exchange of information? What are the incentives? Why do the ratepayers, the stakeholders out there want to change? What's in it for them? What options do they have? Are they living in a monopoly? So how do we change some of those levers, I think, and improve the interaction? And you will see that behavior adjust with the customer.
I mean, I'll just add that, the simple answer that the economist would say, well, is it's just price signals. And then the reality, of course, is that, well, that's a nice thing to say, but it only works if people actually have options then before them. And I do think that we are making progress in seeing providers, as Wendy said, put more options on the table that people can implement. But as Chris noted, we've known that energy efficiency is the first step in this process for decades. And our progress is still limited. We haven't prioritized it to the extent that we need to. And it's going to be critical, because if we can really focus on efficiency, we'll reduce the need for new investment in generation and transmission going forward. And will reduce costs, because those are going to be very significant costs. And it also will enhance our ability to make our system more flexible in terms of demand management and tools like that, which will be critical as we see more variable generation coming onto the grid going forward. So energy efficiency has to take a higher profile at this point.
We have another question. We'll address quickly, and then we'll move into. I have some questions for each of you individually I'd love to get to. So question here is, how would the panelists characterize the role of long duration energy storage in electricity decarbonization in Canada? What project types will be most viable? In which regions will they be most viable soonest? That's from Patrick in Ottawa.
Patrick has lots of questions.
Patrick has good questions.
I love the question. So we have a project that is a pumped storage project, which is longer duration. And so the idea is that you have a reservoir of water that's at a certain height, and when energy at night, same thing, you pump water up to the height, and then you allow the water to then, with the force of gravity, come back down, and that turns the turbine, and that generates electricity. So that's a form of storage. There are other sort of pumped air forms of storage that are getting great traction as well, and that are getting, attracting real dollars in terms of funding. And I'm a big believer that when a technology starts to attract big dollars, that's when it really starts to take off, because then the development happens and you actually get it incorporated into the grid. To your question about the role that it plays in the grid, I also think this is a yes and answer, that we need all forms of storage. We need battery storage, which has other technical elements like frequency modulation that helps to stabilize the grid, as well as the longer term storage that makes sure that our grid is firm and reliable and resilient, so that if a storm happens and maybe some of the other generating assets go out, you have that longer duration storage that can kick in and make sure that, in the winter storm, that we still have access to electricity. So I go back to, I think actually, Tom, you made the point that it's around the planning and the longer term outlook that we need to incorporate all of these different technologies into our planning, because they're all needed and they all play a role. And I would just add on that point that there is, for example, the system operator in Ontario has an RFP out to source 3,500 megawatts of capacity. And the one thing that I think that they're doing, which it's great that they're sourcing it, but they've got that RFP structured in a technology agnostic way. So they're just saying any kind of technology can bid into that RFP. And I think that's the wrong way of doing it. Because the right way of doing it is to recognize that the different forms of capacity, different forms of storage provide different attributes to the grid. And those attributes need to be considered differently and priced differently. And so if I had one ask of the system operator, and I have tremendous respect for the system operator and what they're doing, it's not easy right now, would to be to think maybe a little bit more structured, a little bit more surgically about the different technologies being brought into the grid.
Yeah, I would just say, battery energy storage has expanded very, very rapidly, in part because of the development of battery technology with respect to EVs. But we're going to need that long duration energy storage, absolutely, if we're going to achieve these sorts of targets. There are a variety of technologies, as was mentioned, they're moving forward. In Canada, we also have the capacity to use reservoir hydro as a battery, an advantage that we have relative to many other countries that positions us very well. One of the challenges we face, though, is that energy storage is a product that the electricity system hasn't really seen before. It's a product that can, in essence, feed energy into the grid, can store energy, it's essentially, it can be defined as load or generation or transmission. And in our regulatory structures, they don't know how to deal with a product like that. They want to lump storage into one of these categories and say, well, you have to play by these rules. And really, energy storage can offer such a wide variety of services to the grid that one of the key barriers we face right now is trying to ensure that market structures enable energy storage to be compensated for the services that they do provide, and can sort of outline a vision of a revenue stream that actually enables those projects to move forward. It's not a technology question, it's a market question. And there is a lot of thought going into that right now.
The one thing I'd like to add on the hydroelectric reservoirs is, does it become a financial question of, do they leverage that battery capability? Do they leverage that option they have? And it's really going to be driven by market price at the time of whether it makes sense to leverage that reservoir or not. So I think a couple things we've talked about to this point are the policies and the regulatory bodies. Are they able to adjust and allow better usage of those reservoirs as a battery? And then as a consumer of energy, what is that cutoff point where we are willing to pay more for the energy if it's being produced as a renewable resource? I think are two questions and two outstanding items that need to get addressed.
Right. So we have 16 minutes left, and I have one question for each of you.
Add on to that one, it just would love
sure.
to if
Yep,
that's
you
okay.
can make a quick add.
So one of the things that I really liked and why I joined Northland, I just joined 2 years ago, is that it's a multi-technology company. And so we operate, as I mentioned, natural gas assets as well as renewable assets. And by our math, actually, because thermal assets have a truncated lifespan, and if you built a new thermal plant, you would only underwrite that and assume that that's going to operate for the next 10 years. It means you have to get your return of capital. You got to get all your money back, and then your return on capital. You've got to get your return within that time frame. And if I compare that with a storage project where I can, estimate my models that's going to operate for 20 years, what it means is bringing new storage into the system is cheaper than bringing in new natural gas facilities into the system. So, I like to look at the dollars and cents of things and compare the whole picture. But bringing in new natural gas assets to, meet our growing energy needs in the province is actually more expensive than bringing in battery storage.
All right, so each of our panelists brings a unique perspective today. So I'd like to take a minute to hear about some current initiatives. Wendy, why don't you kick us off? Can you tell us about the next steps for strategic development work at Northland Power in terms of harnessing resources and building strong partnerships?
Yeah, so we're very focused on, as I mentioned, the east coast of Canada. We're very focused on the wind to hydrogen thesis. So that's one strategic priority. There is a similar opportunity on the west coast of Canada. And we'd be looking at developing that. And then we also are very focused on battery storage and pump storage in the province of Ontario. So that's just a few off the top that we're looking at.
Great. Robert, so Canria's 2050 vision for growth of wind energy and solar energy includes producing $8 billion in investment and 28,000 person years of employment annually across Canada. How can this illustrative vision become more realistic?
Yeah, I think there's as I said earlier, we produced a kind of to-do list that sort of highlights this, and I'd say there's a few things. At the federal level, we need clear sort of foundational policies that send clear market signals about the direction we're headed. We have that with a carbon price, although we don't know what's happening to the carbon price after 2030, which is a problem. And we also don't really have the carbon price in any real form on existing natural gas facilities, which also doesn't send a very strong signal at this point in time. We have a clean electricity regulation that the federal government has committed to, which is making a very big difference in terms of discussions around the future of the electricity system in the country. Having that implemented will be important. The federal government also has an important role to play in terms of capacity building and in financing in terms of this sort of stuff. At the provincial level, we're really looking at some of the regulatory and market reform and Chris mentioned this. It's in transmission, it's in procurement, it's across the board. Yeah, Canada, and Wendy mentions Canada.
Robert, your
is compete for investing. See it flow to the United States, and part of that is because it's not just level of incentives and things like that. It's because they've provided a clear vision for what's going to happen over the next decade. In Canada, we don't have that. And that poses a real challenge, because if you're an investor and you're saying, where am I going to invest? You're going to go where you see the least risk, the most policy certainty. And at this time, Canada is not really a competitive destination for investment. So we do need to step up at this point in time by providing a sense of what that longer term vision is going to be, how we're going to scale up, what's the level of procurement we're looking at going forward. Those will all be very important things to ensure that we can attract the capital we need.
Thank you. All right, so Chris, Indigenous leadership is integral to reconciliation and responsible environmental stewardship across Canada. Programs such as Impact Canada Indigenous Off-Diesel Initiative or Step in the Right Direction. How is ICE a change agent for meaningful participation?
Thanks so much for the opportunity to respond to that, Corinne. What I would like to say, I'm going to put the electricity energy question into a people power question. And I think for Indigenous clean energy, it's about families and it's about generational change in youth. So some of the activities that we think of are prime importance, while we have a series of 10, 12 programs in all spheres. I attach great importance to the issue of energy efficient housing. It is the single most important thing we can do to reduce emissions in Indigenous communities. It's the single most important thing we can do for sustainability of communities and including to improve health of people. And so we're embarking at the initiative to see how we can catalyze the $6 to $8 billion needed, but also marry that together with the capacity of the system, along with behavioral change you noted earlier in an earlier question. And part of that is the generational change of who will do this. There's going to be there is a need right now for an incredible need for talent, for ingenuity, and that requires the generational change of leadership. And so through our youth programs of Generation Power and Imagination, we are training Indigenous young people coming out of university and college, helping them to do projects in their communities, but also then putting them into companies for internships for their clean energy careers. So I think we have to realize that this is a multifaceted change process. But we Indigenous Clean Energy want to make sure we really have an impact on families. If families can see how this benefits their homes and how energy transformation is not about energy, but is about their lifestyles, their lives, then I think we have the public support, including in Indigenous communities, to push through the policy changes and the systemic changes we need to really affect change. And latterly, I do think that young people, young Indigenous people, and young non-Indigenous people are going to be at the forefront of that, and we're proud to support them to do that.
That's great. Tom, what are the next steps on the horizon with your utility clients, and can you highlight some of the key features of their investment plans?
Yeah, so I'll focus a little bit on the EV strategy, which I think is one sliver of the journey to net zero, and bring some of the common themes or findings that we're seeing across utilities around the globe as we work with them on their strategies. And we talked about silos a little earlier in the conversation on the macro view across Canada, but those silos exist within the individual utilities as well. And there's a bit of a struggle on who's going to own that strategy going forward. Is that the strategy team? Is that the asset team? Is that the customer team? And depending on how you're looking at it and where you're seeing that EV strategy fit into the broader electrification strategy that these companies has, is really going to determine where the best fit is for that strategy to live and to be executed upon. And there's no one right answer for the various utilities out there, because they're all slightly structured different, all have slightly different strategies and approaches on how to handle this. And then one of the other key things that we're seeing is some of this is being a little bit done on the side of a desk today. So how do you get the investments required? And all the things that we're talking today is how do you get those investments in place? And then you can put a team in place that really can go after this and handle it. And just for EV strategies, we're seeing about the right level of team out there today is 50 to 65 people to get these strategies moving. And if you compound that across the full electrification, you can see that these are big initiatives, they're expensive initiatives, and investments are going to be required to have them move forward. And then the other piece, which is I think a little bit of an uncertainty today, is how are the utility companies going to recover on these investments? How do they work with the government agencies, the regulatory bodies, to allow them to recover as they invest capital costs into the infrastructure? And I think maybe I'll wrap it up by what is the role of the utility going forward? Where do they want to play? Do they want to just stick to being that reliable power? And when someone flips their switch or someone goes to plug in that EV, they have reliable power there to do that. Or do they want to broaden out? Do they want to become a trusted data aggregator? So being that trusted agency to handle the various scopes of emissions and through the supply chain, be able to be the data agency for that. Where do they want to play in the infrastructure of the charging? Do they want to be that player? Do they want to have that as a segment of their grid? If you think their grids cover the vastness of Canada, does that become then a second grid, if you will, for these utility companies? So I think the key here is there's lots of findings and lots of questions still to answer, but it's going to come from the collaboration of all of the different entities out there, whether it be the auto manufacturers, the regulatories, the government agencies, and then the utility companies themselves working as one to come up with the vision and execute on that vision.
Thank you. Well, we are down to
Corinne,
our
if I could add just a very brief
Yeah, please go ahead.
word before we close. I think we have to, in this transformation, ask what did you get? And what do you get for people and economies, and not be too hunkered down in our angels in the head of the pin situations in terms of the electricity markets. Let's make sure we appeal to the broader good. I will be releasing my next book in about 4 months' time, which is looking at how clean energy can advance the sustainable development goals, which is about gender and economy and health and economic development, things like that. So let's make sure that as we power this change process, we make sure it talks about what does it get you and what does it get people.
We have just a few minutes, so I think what we can do is I've got a last question, and maybe I can give each of you kind of a chance to sort of have a bit of a wrap up, probably about a minute or so each. And the question is, it's one that's asked often: is it possible for an electricity sector to be 100% renewable based? So I don't know, who wants to start?
I mean, I can start. We already have that now. Quebec, for example, is 100% renewable. Ontario, as I mentioned, is 94% renewable. We need to keep it that way as we go forward. But I think it's absolutely possible to do it in a way that is, both reliable and low cost. Like that's the objective of the grid, is to have something that is, reliable, resilient through storms and other weather activities. Is decarbonized and is being brought on in a way that's affordable to all. I think that we can do that.
Excellent. Anyone like to build on that or to offer some final thoughts?
I would say yes, as long as, to Robert's point earlier, that we build energy efficiency as the key platform to get there, and that we make sure that we have the systemic change to use renewable energy more effectively. So we can do that, but let's ground that in also making sure we get megawatts when we don't need to use energy, So that needs to be balanced with the generation side of the question of renewables. But with those both, can we get there? Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, the only build is the battery advancement, I think, is key and critical in making that shift to 100% renewable. I think learn from others. There's other countries that are more advanced in their journeys than we are, and what can we take from those learnings and apply here and not reinvent the wheel, and act now. I think we talked a lot in this session about log jams and the different stakeholders and what is in it for them, but I think coming together and acting now, and it is possible.
Yeah, actually, Tom, you just triggered a thought. It's not only possible, it's imperative. We have to do it. And even just for the simple reason that if we want to be competitive on a global basis and continue to attract, manufacturing and other, commercial activities, those companies have made commitments to their stakeholders, to their customers, that they're going to run off of a green supply chain. And if we can't offer a decarbonized grid, then those companies are going to go elsewhere.
Yeah, I would agree. We need to do it for environmental reasons. We need to do it for economic reasons. And I would also say that if Canada as a country is not a country that can succeed in getting there, I don't have a lot of hope for others. But I am very optimistic that Canada and others can get there. We're starting with a tremendous renewable energy base already in terms of our hydropower. We have massive untapped renewable energy resources distributed across the country. We're very well positioned to be a global leader in terms of making this transition going forward. And if we do that, that will position us very well, as was just mentioned, in terms of being able to compete in the net zero economy going forward.
Fantastic. Are there any other, we've been putting a whole bunch of links in the chat here. So I would say to anyone who hasn't had a chance yet, there's a bunch of links in there referencing a lot of the reports and guides and things that are coming up there. But is there any other recommendations from our panel for those people out there who want to learn more on the subject, that you would kind of point them in a direction, either to a person, to a website, where they could learn more?
Corinne, we just relaunched our Indigenous Clean Energy website. It has tons of information. We also have a digital platform called the ICE Network, which is icenet.work. Don't go to ice.network. That's a figure skating site. That's not us. But at icenet.work, there are 1,600 people on there with information on Indigenous projects. Anyone can participate. There's no cost. There's a lot of interactivity. So the more interactivity, I think there needs to be a coming together of this much more profoundly to get us there. So that's what we can offer from our end.
Fantastic.
I guess I'll offer just one shameless plug, and it was mentioned in the chat just to say that our Electricity Transformation Canada conference is happening at the end of October 26th to 28th in Toronto. It's the largest gathering of sort of renewable energy professionals in the country every year. And we'll be addressing through the program there a lot of the questions that we've talked about today.
Fantastic. All right, to anyone who are attendees online here today, if you haven't already, please go to the poll questions. We haven't had a chance to go through them together, but we do use the information from those poll questions in the following up article. So you would see that in our upcoming issue or online with EJ. So thank you to all of our panelists and to Connie Vitello, who's the editor of Environment Journal, for her efforts in pulling this fantastic panel discussion together. Big thank you to all of you, our attendees. Your participation through the chat feature and poll questions, especially Patrick today, really infuses these events with a sense of community that wouldn't otherwise be possible. In fact, many of the webinar topics that we cover are the direct result of recommendations from Environment Journal readers. So please keep sending us your ideas. If you follow Actual Media at the top of your screen, you'll automatically get notifications for the latest information on upcoming webinars. And thank you again, stay safe, and we'll see you all next time.